Hi, my name's Dr. Trinka, and I'm here to talk about migraines today and the things that I know from what I've learned in the past 30 years to help migraines. First, a little bit about me, and um, I want to talk a little bit about my education. I'm a neurooptometrist. I'm a certified nutritionist. I'm a syntonic optometrist, and I've been practicing for over 30 years. Some of you may ask, what is a syntonic optometrist? A certified nutritionist is pretty obvious. I deal with food and physiology. A neurooptometrist is kind of another one of those things I should explain a little bit. Many optometrists just make the chart clear and look for eye health problems. A neurooptometrist tries to figure out how the eye and the brain are connected and to improve those connections. A syntonic optometrist is an optometrist that has joined a club of dedicated eye doctors who believe and have seen evidence that colored light helps people in their brain and in their vision and in their health. So that's a little bit about me. So let's talk a little bit about migraines. Migraines are definitely more than an obnoxious headache. And the reason why is because there's a ton of neurological symptoms that go on with migraines. And we're going to get into all that in just a sec. Essentially, it's overexcitability of the brain that basically trivial stimuli can set off into all of these neurological symptoms. And there's two ways that I can help based on my clinical experience, and that is things that have to do with eyes and retina and brain, and things that have to do with nutrition. And so those are the topics that we're going to talk about tonight. So the signs and the symptoms of a migraine are something that if you have a migraine, you already know all this. But typically, it's an intense headache. And what people don't realize is the intensity. And they just think, oh, this is a bad headache, get over it. But it's not that at all. This is debilitating. And if you've had one or you know somebody that had one, you know how absolutely out of commission they are when they have one of these things called a migraine. There's sensitivities to light and sound, and sometimes the symptoms of a migraine are also the triggers to the migraine, and we're going to get into that in just a second. And look at all these things that these are all neurological issues because they have to do with brain, and these are what happens to many people that have migraines. And there's all kinds of classifications of migraines. There's migraines that have to do with memory. There's ones that have to do with nausea, visual disturbance, which is my specialty, dizziness or vestibular migraines can cause massive fatigue. Hey, if I had a debilitating headache, I'd be tired, and can also produce anxiety and depression. So oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes there's something called an aura. And an aura will tell you, it usually precedes the bad headache, and it'll usually point towards a part of the brain that's being affected, the part of the brain that's hyperexcitable. And so the most common one is visual changes. And this is usually jagged lines that start in the center of your vision and then move out to the periphery. And then oftentimes there's just a blank spot where you can't see. If this is the first time you've ever had a migraine, this will freak you out. It'll feel like, and many patients have told me, it feels like I'm having a stroke. And then, of course, they're not. Although there are vascular or blood vessel changes associated with visual changes in migraines, it's the most common one. But other things that can happen, you can have changes in taste or in smell, and or you hear things differently, or you feel things differently. Any kind of the sensory input that comes into the brain that's not normal, and it's usually kind of a forewarning that you're going to get a nasty headache. So the key point that I want to make in this whole lecture is that migraines come from a couple of places. One, you have this excitability of the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Those are fancy terms for saying the brain and spinal cord and your ability to deal with the whole fight or flight, rest and digest system. So very interesting as to why it's excitable. And another way to talk about this, there's a concept called threshold. So in your brain, you have a bunch of neurons, right? And something's going to make that neuron fire its signal to the next neuron. And what happens is that the people that have migraines generally have a much, much closer to firing point than the rest of the population. And that's what makes their neurons so excitable. And so trivial stimulus like looking at, the glint off of a windshield from the sun glare can set off a migraine, where we would just say, that's obnoxious, it's just a glare. It'll set off a migraine in a person because their neurons are so close to firing. Another reason that migraines can occur is because a person gets a hit on the head, a concussion, and that can make their neurons, because of the impact, it can make their neurons so much closer to firing. Migraines. So then, we should talk a little bit about the triggers, what we would say in the people who don't have migraines, the people who would say that's nothing. These are called triggers for people who have neurons that are close to firing. So let's talk a little bit about triggers. So there's all kinds of triggers, and many people know what their triggers are, but some people don't. They have migraines and they haven't figured it out. In the food arena, it's usually inflammatory foods. But it can be foods that also have certain compounds and chemicals in them. I learned about this a very long time ago when I knew very little about migraines, and I knew that certain types of cheeses and a compound in red wine called tannin could set people off with migraines. But that's a very small sample size compared to what could potentially set off a migraine in a person that's susceptible. By the way, people who have these triggers more often than not, in fact, way more often than not, 90% of the time, have somebody in their family that has a similar scenario. So there is a familial or genetic component to migraines. So foods can definitely do it. And there's all kinds of ways to talk about foods and how they can be reduced or eliminated to prevent the frequency and intensity of migraines. Stress in all of its many faces is a great trigger for migraines, very powerful. So it can be any kind of emotional stress, the classic things that America deals with, which is relationships and money and what am I doing with my life and things like that, can all be triggers for migraines. Odors, smells can trigger a migraine. Flickering lights, flashing lights can trigger migraines. Visual patterns. This is a really interesting one to me because I know a couple of eye doctors in different parts of the world that have had visual patterns set off migraines. And what this is called is pattern glare. This is a phenomenon where person looks at a striped pattern or a repeating pattern, and just by the mere looking at it, the pattern of the visual, whatever they're looking at, starts to wave and shimmer and move. And we, as people that don't have migraines, that group of people would say, nothing's happening. It looks like a bunch of stripes. But for them, it starts to change and to move, and that in effect can produce a migraine. Excessive heat and noise are also triggers for a migraine. One of the interesting things that I learned over the years in dealing with migraines is most people who have migraines are women, more than about 85%. And we think this is because of the changes in hormone levels that a woman goes through either in their cycle or in their life. and typically has to do with the rising and falling of estrogen. So that's another trigger for a migraine. Irregular eating patterns, and this gets to the whole blood sugar topic, can be a problem. If your blood sugar is really low, that can trigger a migraine. And changing sleep patterns. We could probably do an entire webinar on these last three things: hormone levels, how to eat and when to eat, and the frequency of eating, and about sleep as well. So these are the triggers that people often experience for migraines. So when I see a person that is suffering from a migraine, I learned a new word when I was putting this together, and the term for people who are affected by migraines are migraineurs. So when I see a migraineur or a person that has migraine, it's critical to take a detailed history to find out what kind of stresses they have in their life. How do they eat? How do they sleep? Do they have a family history of migraines? Do they have a tendency towards depression and anxiety already, so that the slightest bit of stress can push them over the edge and give them a migraine? And also, when did it start? When, and how do their triggers manifest? So detailed history in actually seeing any person to help them with their health is critical, to take a really good history. It's an art as much as a science. So once you have the history and you have a pretty good idea of what's going on with that person, then laboratory testing comes into play. And the reason why you want to do laboratory testing is because that's how you find out what physiological factors are affecting the brain. The brain and the metabolism of the person are inexplicably intertwined. You can't remove one from the other. They play with each other all the time. And so GI testing, blood work, and imaging, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, are important to rule in and rule out what can be possible reasons for the neurons being hyperexcitable or very easily fired. So once I finish laboratory testing, then I do a comprehensive eye exam, pupil testing, color vision testing, and neuro-optometric testing, which is what we call a neuro-optometric exam. So I'm going to talk about all of these things next. So let's talk about lab testing. So in lab testing, one of the things that I've learned a long time ago is that your brain can't work well if you cannot carry oxygen to it, or you cannot carry fuel to it. So oxygen is often based on whether or not you have proper levels of something called hemoglobin in your red blood cells. And hemoglobin, in the very center of the hemoglobin molecule, is iron. And if you are anemic or have a type of anemia, there are many types other than iron, but if you have iron anemia, we want to find out if you can deliver oxygen to your brain, because if you can't, what's going to happen potentially to the neurons in your brain? Yeah, you're right. They're going to be hyperexcitable. Many people in the United States have thyroid problems, much more underreported than what I see as the statistics. I would say it's close to 30 to 40 million people have thyroid problems in America. That's a chunk of people. So thyroid metabolism affects brain, just like brain affects thyroid. So you have to rule out thyroid issues if there's going to be a thorough investigation of physiology into the aspects of what's causing a migraine. Glucose markers, that's the fuel part. If you cannot deliver fuel to your brain, your neurons can't work correctly. And so it's like Goldilocks. It's like Goldilocks in a whole bunch of things in health. Not too much, not too little, right in the middle. And so it's true for glucose as well. You don't want to have your blood sugar drop. You don't want it to be too high, because both of those things negatively affect the brain. I don't know if you guys know what a CBC, or politically correct. I don't know if the people that are listening to the webinar know what a CBC is, but a CBC stands for a complete blood count. And in this part of a standard blood chemistry, you can find out what's going on with your white blood cells, what's going on with your red blood cells, what does your immune system think about how your body is doing? And you can often pick up immune challenges that can affect brain function. So it's a critical part. It's also one of the least expensive parts of any kind of a blood chemistry. It's super valuable. One of the things I'm very fond of saying to my patients is there's an 8-lane panel, or excuse me, 8-lane highway between the gut and the brain. And so if you've got gut problems, I'm pretty sure you have brain problems. And or if not now, you soon will if you don't fix the gut problems. So one of the things that I think is very useful is to do a comprehensive GI panel where they look at stool and find out if there's any unwanted house guests, if there's inflammation, if you digest food well. There's just an absolute abundance of information that comes from a comprehensive GI panel. And then finally, if most of the people who have migraines are female, and um, and that's true, then you want to take a look at hormones. And even if it's a guy, you can definitely test hormones to find out if they're a player in affecting the brain in terms of its hyperexcitability. So that covers lab testing. Um, then I get into a comprehensive eye exam. And optometry is kind of funny because in the past, all that was really measured was how you see a lit chart in a dim room when everybody's really quiet and still with a big machine that cuts off your peripheral vision. And the more I got into neurooptometry about 6 years ago, the more I realized that there's so much more to looking at how the eye and the brain connect. But in a standard and detailed and comprehensive optometric examination, you definitely want to do a lot of the things that optometry is known for, which is opening up your pupil to make sure there's no retinal problems. The retina, in my view, is just a forward extension of the brain. And so if there are problems in the retina, there are often problems in the brain. You have to get kind of a prescription for distant and near. It's unbelievable to me how different people are in how they observe their particular visual deficit. I have people that drive to me from Breckenridge and they can barely see the big E on the wall and they're fine. I don't think they're fine, but they think they're fine. And then other people, they can see the 20/20 line and they swear they're blind. So it's really interesting how people perceive their own visual deficits. But a part of a detailed optometric exam is you have to get a decent distance and near prescription. Another thing that is often foregone in eye exams that are based on only acuity and health is how do the muscles that move your eyes balance from one eye to another? That can cause an enormous amount of stress in trying to hold things single, because if you don't have good muscle balance, you can definitely see double, or even if you don't see double, your brain's effort to make you see single is so great, it can be a trigger for migraines. Accommodation is a fancy term for focusing. Focusing is only something that happens up close. It is, you don't focus on a street sign 50 feet away. Your focusing system completely at rest at that point. So we want to test how you can see things up close and far away, regardless if you're starting to lose your focusing system as a result of the aging process. Another part of a good eye exam is to measure the pressure inside your eye, because that's a super indicator for glaucoma, which can destroy your vision from the outside in. And another thing that can give you a clue as to a problem with visual processing or glaucoma is to test the side vision, the peripheral field, and also your central field. So that is what comprises a decent, detailed, comprehensive eye examination. So inside the eye exam, doctors are trained to take a quick look at pupils just to make sure that they react to light equally. And so, and when you look at any doctor's forms, you're going to see under the pupil section, PERRL, pupils equally round and react to light. And that's about as far as they go. They just want to look and say, hey, if I shine a light in, what happens? But the pupils, because they're hooked up into the fight or flight nervous system, can give you so much information about other things that are happening with the brain. In syntonic or color therapy language, we use colors as Greek letters. So alpha is red and omega is violet. And there's such a thing, there's such a phenomenon called an alpha omega pupil. And this is where, when you shine a light in a person's eye, you would expect that that pupil constricts. And of course, in almost all cases, it does. But if you shine the light there and you kind of keep it there for 10 to 15 seconds, you would expect the pupil to remain small and constricted, right? Well, in this phenomenon of alpha omega pupil, you shine a light into the eye, you watch it constrict, and it immediately or slowly rebounds and gets big and dilated again. And so that's definitely an abnormal finding, and it indicates that there's something going on with the brain in its ability to handle stress. It also relates to adrenal gland function. So another thing that can give you a clue is just the size of the pupil. Is it pinprick? Is it enormous? Is there a difference between the right and the left? These are all things that indicate problems with the brain. And so one of the things that a person who really believes that light therapy and the system in your body that relates to fight or flight and rest and digest can show, knows that that particular nervous system called the autonomic shows itself through pupil responses. And so this is just a valuable, if you know how to read it, it's a valuable way to look at the brain through the pupil. And there are nuclei in a certain portion of the brain that are connected to the muscles in the colored part of your eye that control pupil constriction and dilation. So a phenomenal way to get an idea of, is there something going on here with the fight or flight, rest and digest, so-called autonomic nervous system, and are there imbalances there? So when we do syntonic optometry, or another fancy word is photobiomodulation, medical doctors usually respond to that one, but the general lay public usually responds to colored light therapy or color therapy. We almost always end up doing something called a color field. And in a color field, you look at this grid pattern with one eye, and then the examiner brings a white dot from different parts of the periphery. And when the person's looking at the central white cross, they notice it, they signal the examiner, and so the examiner makes a little mark, like here or any place on this white field. And so this particular color field is fairly small. Normally, color fields are 35. You can see the little gradation markers on here. There's like 35 to 40 degrees. And so that's the first part of a color field. The second part of the color field is to take a small dot that's a red, a green, or a blue dot and put it right in the center cross, and then have the person memorize it and bring it in from the side with the instructions, tell me when it looks identical to how it did in the center. And so the examiner brings the red dot in from the side, and as soon as the person said, yep, it looks the same, then you make a little mark, and you do 8 different meridians, and you plot what they call a red field, the same thing with green, and the same thing with blue. These all mean a lot of different things. We could do a webinar just on this because it means so much. Green is related to toxicity, red is related to circulation, blue is related to emotional issues. And you can look at these things and make judgments about what's going on with that person. The other thing that we do is we measure the blind spot. So from the right of center here, you see that black circle with a dot in the middle. That's the size of a normal blind spot. Everybody has a blind spot because there's a part of your retina that doesn't have any rods and cones. That's the big highway, the pipeline from your eye into your brain called the optic nerve. So everybody's got a place where they don't see, and that's called the blind spot. Well, this blind spot that we're seeing in this picture is enormous. This is a person that came in about 2 weeks ago, and she had multiple sclerosis. And one of the signs, not in every multiple sclerosis person, but one of the signs of multiple sclerosis is an inflammation of the optic nerve. And so when the optic nerve is inflamed, you'll see this giant um, blind spot. So color fields are a way of also looking at how's the brain working? How are the brain and retina, the eye-brain connection? How's that working? Is it shut down and closed like this person? Is it expansive and open like people who have gone through light therapy get to? It's a great peek into whether or not the autonomic nervous system is balanced, and that, of course, relates to the brain. So now we get into the neuro exam, and the neuro-optic exam is quite different than a standard exam. And a standard exam is, all the things that I went over before. Looking inside the retina, making sure that there's no abnormalities, getting a prescription, muscle balance testing. All of that stuff is under the purview of a standard comprehensive eye exam. When you do a neuro exam, you're trying to figure out how does the person relate to space? How does their vision relate to how they walk, how they hold their body, and whether or not they have good balance? One of the extremely interesting things I learned in the last 6 years is that people don't hear and see efficiently. Sometimes they're way canted into hearing at the expense of vision, and sometimes they're way canted into vision at the expense of hearing. And so they have difficulties in life. And this auditory visual connection is one of the most interesting things I do in a detailed neuro exam. And here's the process. So I ring a bell with the person's eyes closed somewhere between their shoulders and the top of their head. And I have them touch the bell, or at least attempt to touch it. Most people are terrible at it until you put something in front of their eyes that connects their eye and their ears, which seems really odd when I first learned about this, because I thought, well, how can you put things in front of a closed eyelid and make any difference whatsoever? But what I learned was 20% of the signals that come from your retina to your brain have nothing to do with vision. And light's still getting through your closed eyelid. So you can put a variety of different kinds of lenses in front of a person, and they can go from absolute pathetic in trying to find the bell to right on the money no matter where you put it. They know exactly where it is. That is a great way to sync up different parts of your brain and reduce stress. And remember, we're talking about migraines here. The whole idea is to reduce stress on the brain. So another really critical aspect of brain function is how the brain signals the eyes to move. And there's a great instrument called a right eye, and it has 4 infrared sensors on a computer screen. You sit about, 20, 24 inches away from the screen, and there's a red light that goes back and forth, up and down, and in circles in different patterns, and you follow it. And then it has a printout of what's going on with your eye movements, which is really a wonderful peek into brain function. So here is a printout of what a right eye looks like. And so it'll tell you the part of the brain that's affected in the right-hand part of that screen. For this person, the bottom part of their brain, the cerebellum, is affected by how they move their eyes, and also the frontal cortex, the very front of your brain. And so it gives you the score, and it's normed for your age. So your age is kind of, they took a bunch of people that are around your age, and They normed it and said, this is where you compare to the people that are like you, at least in terms of age. And so this person obviously um, did not so good with something called pursuits. They're in the 30th percentile. Did even worse. A pursuit is just you following something that's moving. A saccade is a very specific type of eye movement that involves a different part of your brain, and it makes your eyes jump from one place to another place, hopefully accurately, not under or overshooting. So this person did even worse here. And then it also asks you in this test just to look at a dot and just keep your eyes there. And you would think that people would have no problems just keeping their eyes on a dot. But I've seen all kinds of crazy things. And then this person that did this right eye did actually pretty good. They're in the 73rd percentile, which would put them into the functional range. So this is another great way to figure out what's going on with the brain that we can help. And unless you know what's going on, it's really hard to get the right therapies to help, which brings us to the next idea. And so now you've collected all this data. What do we want to do with it? And so here's what I think. I think that there's 4 things that you can do in my office or in the office that I'm in part-time, which is Dr. Stedman's office. And that is nutritional programs, resolving deficiencies, light therapy, because we spent some time talking about color fields and light therapy, and then, of course, our neuro optometric tools. Let's take a look at each one of these things briefly. So in nutritional programs, because what you eat goes to your gut, and because your gut has the potential to be inflamed by what you eat, we definitely want to make sure that you're eating the right things and you're not eating inflammatory foods. Most often, that's gluten, dairy, soy, and corn, but there's definitely other things. And these are not fads. Gluten is not a fad. It is a real thing. Same thing with commercial dairy. They do have the potential to be inflammatory to your brain. Because remember my 8-lane highway analogy between your brain and your gut? This is so true here. So that's the inflammatory aspect of it. But I alluded to this before, and one of the things that you really want to make sure is your blood sugar doesn't drop. And so oftentimes people are eating great foods, high quality, not inflammatory. They just have the wrong frequency. They don't eat enough or they eat too much. Small, frequent meals of protein is generally the way to at least initially stabilize your blood sugar. There's definitely other strategies, like intermittent fasting, but right for this particular circumstance, you want small, frequent meals to keep your blood sugar steady so that your brain is fed proper amounts of fuel throughout the day. That's super important. And then avoiding neuroexcitatory additives is enormous. So let me dig into this a little bit. There was a famous neurosurgeon by the name of Russell Blaylock, and he wrote a book called Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills. And in it, he just absolutely goes into depth about certain chemicals that are in foods that essentially cause the neurons in your brain to blow up. And those are called excitotoxins. They excite the nerves so much. And remember, migraines are a problem with hyperexcitability, right? So what kind of neuroexcitatory additives am I talking about? Well, the 2 biggies are MSG and aspartame. In fact, if you look up into the governmental website of the FDA for additive complaints, the number 1 complained about additive is aspartame, and it's in so many things. So this is a baddie. You got to stay away from this stuff. Also, there's a new one that came out because there were so many complaints about aspartame, NutraSweet, whatever you want to call it. And this is sucralose. And this is one tiny little atom away from chlorine. Again, a nasty neuroexcitatory additive. You want to stay away from these things. If you even come close, I mean, even if you don't have migraines, you want to stay away from this stuff because it's just not good for you. So those are the nutritional programs that I generally embark on with patients with migraines. Um, One of the things that's also been absolutely verified in the literature is that certain nutritional deficiencies cause migraines. So you have, the B vitamins, vitamin D, magnesium, and these last three, if alpha lipoic acid, CoQ10, and carnitine, they're all nutrients for the little energy centers that are inside your neurons. And so if you don't have enough really good elements for producing energy, your neurons are going to be unstable and much more susceptible to migrainous activity. Did you know that magnesium is the number one mineral deficiency in America? And so it's involved in over 500 reactions in your body. So that's another biggie. That's huge. Vitamin D, one of the most common vitamin deficiencies. I think there's an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency in America. So there's lab ways and there's supplement ways to either find out about your nutritional deficiencies and resolve them. So this is super important as well. So those are the nutrition things. Why don't we get into a little bit into the vision things and the optometric things? So light therapy, syntonics, or photobiomodulation, all the same thing. They all mean the same thing. We're going to do something with light and color, and we're going to affect your brain and your health and your eyes. The cool thing is that you can stimulate or depress. And you would say, well, if the neurons are excitable, why would you want to stimulate them? Well, some pathways, and actually that's a really good point, because most people that are helped by migraines generally tend towards the green and blue, but not everybody. Colors are very specific to the individual. They're highly personalized. And there's three ways you can do it. You can put a tint in lenses. You can wear these little cardboard goggles that have a filter in them of a certain frequency of color. Or you can look at a light that has a filter in front of it and look at that. All are great. They all have their pros and cons, and they all can either stimulate or depress brain function. Back to stimulation. Not all pathways, when you stimulate, produce a stimulating effect in your brain. If you have a pathway in your brain that inhibits and you stimulate that inhibitory pathway, what are you going to get? You're going to get inhibition. You're going to get depression. So that's why I put stimulate or depress brain function. I know that's a little weird, but it's true. So light therapy can be a potentially powerful source for decreasing the frequency and the intensity of migraines. Super easy and cool tool with almost no side effects. So what kind of tools do I use as a optometrist? Well, I can use the lenses from the original prescription. Why? It's useful to get a prescription that allows a person to see. That's almost never the prescription I use. I usually modify it, either adding a little farsighted or nearsighted, adding or taking away a little stigmatism, because it has massive effects on how you perceive the world. For instance, the more nearsighted prescription you get, the sharper things are centrally and the more distorted your periphery is. Or if you have even the littlest bit of too much of a prescription, it can tighten up your neck muscles. That's a source of stress. What does stress do to already excitable neurons? It fires them. And so you can produce a migraine just by an inappropriate pair of glasses. So lenses have all kinds of things that you can do to either expand or contract peripheral space as you look through this. And this is so much a different concept than is the chart clear, what's better, one or two, can you see 20/20? Although I will tell you that that's a good starting point. Filters, we talked a lot about color filters and how they can depress and excite neurons in the brain. But equally important is not only what light comes into the retina to stimulate different parts of the retina, but what parts of the retina can you put stop light from coming into? and where you can put in a little occlusion filter to stop light from hitting a certain part of the retina. I have seen phenomenal results in a lot of health problems just by blocking light from coming into a certain part of the retina. One of my neuro buddies in Australia, she had pattern glare, and the only thing that helped her was to put occlusions on the inner part of her glasses. And when she did, it was like a cool bath. Just and she could deal with her life, and she didn't have migraines near intense or as frequent. So occlusion is a really big player in trying to help brain function. And then the last thing is what people don't understand a lot. I've decided prisms are not a light. It's not a lens that focuses. It takes light and it moves it around, and it always moves it. You can imagine a prism like a triangle, right? So if light hits a triangle, it's going to deviate light towards the top of the apex of the triangle. So you can put glasses on a person with prisms, and you can direct light to very specific parts of the retina. For instance, if I put the base of the prism down at the bottom of the glasses, that's going to direct light up towards the top, but it'll stimulate the bottom retina. That usually sends more signals to the temporal lobe. So, for instance, if a person has a migraine and they have memory issues, much of the memory processing in a person's brain is in the temporal lobe. So you can help accelerate or calm down, depending on what you're trying to do, neuron activity in that part of the brain. So prisms are extremely cool, and you can change posture, balance. You can help migraines. You can quiet down parts of the brain. You can excite parts of the brain just with prism. So very, very cool tool. It's one of the things I almost always look at when I'm trying to help a person with any kind of a brain problem. So that's about it for this webinar. My conclusion is, I think it's don't suffer. Call somebody. Hopefully me or the great folks and doctors at Integrated Brain Centers or Integrated Health Denver. And just because you've been suffering for a while doesn't mean you can't have help. So I think one of the best things that you can do if you are a migraine sufferer, or if you know a person that's suffering migraines, call the number on the screen for a free 30-minute consultation. I'll be happy to talk to anybody and see if they're appropriate for the care that we deliver at Integrated Brain Centers. So my last statement here is, know that migraines and a bunch of other neuro issues can be helped with specialized neuro-optometric tools and nutritional strategies to reintegrate the connection between your eyes and your brain. I also have a private practice up in Conifer, and you can go to my website, iBrain Connection, to schedule also a free 30-minute consultation. So that's it, everybody. These are some resources that you can use to learn more about me and what I do. I'm really appreciative of having people on the webinar. And if you want to schedule a free consultation, reach me through either Dr. Stedman's office and the Integrative Health Denver website, or the iBrain Connection website. I really appreciate you listening, and stay tuned for next Tuesday's webinar with the ultra smart Jake Meyer and his talk on EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprogram, which is a phenomenal way to handle emotional distress. Have a great rest of the week, everybody. Take care.